So when I do this talk in person, I ask people, what is the number one thing that pops into their head? How do you describe a slug? And hands go up, and always, every time I've ever given this talk, I get the same response. And that response is slimy. Yes, that is the first thing just about anybody thinks of when you hear and want to describe a slug. And slugs need moist habitats. And that is a very central fact about their biology that drives all kinds of aspects of them being a pest. So slugs thrive in habitats that are not only moist, but protected, undisturbed, and kind of moderate in temperature. They don't like very high temperatures. They're soft-bodied, they're kind of exposed. They need that protected environment and temperatures that aren't too hot. They don't want to be baked, basically. And the type of agriculture where these conditions are particularly prominent is no-till and fields with a lot of a cover crop adoption. And this is a practice that is increasingly common, and I think that's why we're getting more and more slug problems. These types of habitats provide many benefits. Agronomically, they are good for weed control, erosion, soil moisture. That's important, conserving soil moisture. It's good for soil health. But then the downside is when you get this moisture and when you get this crop residue that provides that protected environment, you are opening the door for slug problems. And in fact, most of the slug problems that we get called about are in no-till fields and in cover crop fields. Now, this is a bigger problem in some parts of the country than others. Slugs are especially a problem in the eastern corn belt, and I would kind of put Ohio into that category compared to states like Iowa and Nebraska. The middle Atlantic states like New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland tend to have pretty extreme slug problems. Again, this has to do a lot with moisture and rainfall. And then also places that have high no-till adoption and moisture, both of those things together. This is a annual average precipitation map of the United States. And the greener it is, the wetter it is. And I used to work in South Dakota, and this is a very dry state, a lot less precipitation than in Ohio. Now, cover crop, no-till adoption actually was quite high in South Dakota, but we didn't have those slug problems because it was very dry. And in fact, that's why cover crop adoption is very high there. They're doing everything they can to conserve soil moisture. And then when I came to work in Ohio, all of a sudden, slugs became part of the repertoire of pests that I was helping farmers with. I think that slugs are much more prominent as a problem now than, let's say, 20 years ago. We've had a lot of cool, wet springs, which are favorable for slugs, and we are seeing increased adoption of no-till and cover crops. And also, we have more farms now that have been in no-till for long periods of time. And the longer a farm or a field has been in no-till, the more and more favorable it gets for slugs. Slugs have a chance to accumulate their populations. There's lots of soil residue to provide nice habitat. Now, unfortunately, even though slug problems are increasing, we really don't have a lot of research on slugs as pests in field crops. It's historically less of a problem. And because it's only a problem in certain parts of the country, it's not really a focus of research and development by big companies that tend to want to develop products that are good throughout the growing region for a given crop. There has not been a lot of USDA and nonprofit research. But on the bright side, more land-grant university research is going on in slugs. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of that research a little bit later in this talk. A little bit now about slug biology and the type of damage that slugs do. There are several species of slugs that you may find in field crops, but really the most common is the gray garden slug. And slugs are very broad in their diet. They can eat many different types of plants. They're not picky eaters. We can see problems in canola, corn, soybean, small grains, forages, alfalfa. I was at an extension meeting just yesterday and somebody was talking about the problems he was having with slugs in wheat. This is a shot of damage to early season corn from slugs. The next slide is damage to soybean, and you can see that that field, once you get beyond the edges, is virtually wiped out from slug damage. And this next one is an aerial view of slug damage to a field, which is really quite striking. So you can see that this is a real problem in early season crops, or it can be if the conditions are wrong. I love this picture. This really gets people's attention. This is a mower head after going through alfalfa, and all that gray, that's not leaf litter, that is slugs. That mower head is covered with slugs. And here is another shot taken on the same night by a different grower, and everything you see on that piece of equipment is slugs. We don't always have firm estimates of damage, but a ballpark estimate in the Middle Atlantic region is a 20% yield loss in corn and soybean from slug damage. And soybean can actually have worse damage at the end of the day than corn. And the reason for this is that the differences in growth style, soybeans have an exposed growing point as it's coming up out of the ground. And if the slugs eat that, it's game over for the plant. And so you have a greater chance of stand loss, whereas if slugs are feeding on the leaves of corn, they're not necessarily getting down to the growing point. And so the plant has a better chance of recovery. And as I said, slugs are not picky eaters. They can also feed on weeds and organic matter, so that they don't just have to rely on those plants in the field. The slug life cycle is fairly simple. The adults can live more than 1 year, and they lay these eggs down in the soil that look like little clear BBs. And a gray garden slug female can lay 500 eggs per year. And these eggs hatch into little baby slugs, basically juveniles that just keep getting bigger and bigger until they are adults. So the life cycle overlaps, not well synchronized. It's not like with some insects where you always have this life stage at the beginning of the year, you always have this life stage in the middle. Because the adults can live longer than a year, you can have some overlap of life stages. But generally speaking, the most damage and the most damage from juveniles that have hatched and are growing and eating lots so they can grow happens at this point early in the growing season, April, May, maybe a little bit of June. That is the typical time of real damage to soybean and also to corn. This time period corresponds pretty exactly with the planting period for corn and soybean, which is part of why we have this problem. So you have all these, in the spring, you have all these juveniles. They've hatched, they need to grow, they need to put on body weight, they're hungry. And at just this time, you have crop planting, and the slugs, as they get bigger, they eat more and more. And you have small plants. Actually, to be technical about it, slug feeding happens in the field throughout the year, but you just don't notice the damage in the middle of the summer when the plants are big and it's trivial. It's just not a problem. But when those plants are small, that is when you see the slug problems because they're really vulnerable to the feeding damage. We do have some tips for slug management. The first portion that occurs for any pest problem is scouting. Diagnose the problems in your field. Now, slugs are nocturnal. You're not really going to find them out and about and doing their thing during the day. You can see the damage. It can be easy to confuse the damage with other things. So if you want to really verify that it's slugs, go out at dusk with a flashlight, take a look. They'll be out and about on the plants. So go out after sundown, and you want to keep an eye on a field that has problems also in the fall, because slugs don't move around a whole lot. And if you have a large population in the fall, that population is going to be large in the spring. The easiest way to monitor for slugs is it's very low tech. You can take a small piece of plywood, maybe a couple few pieces of a square foot of plywood, put it out in the field, and then go out in the morning before it gets hot and lift it up and peek under there and see, do I have almost no slugs? Do I have a ton of slugs? We don't have really solid threshold guidelines. It's just you want to get a sense. Do I have a little bit? Do I have a lot? You can also do this with shingle material. That's what we do in our research. We have square foot shingles that we've spray painted white so they don't get real hot. And we pin those down with a garden stake with a stake so they don't blow away. And that's what we use as a monitoring tool. You also want to monitor in the spring for how bad are your populations, what kind of injury are you experiencing. And there really are not a lot of rescue treatments, but there are some rescue treatments. The main one being a molluscicide bait. Now, again, we don't have good thresholds. It's something we're trying to work towards, but you can kind of tell if you're having a real problem and whether you want to invest in any of these baits. The younger your plants are, the worse your damage potential is when you have heavy feeding. So if your plants are kind of well grown and you're finding a lot of slugs, you may be able to get away with letting the plants outgrow the problem. Now, I said tillage, no-till is where you see a lot of the slug problems. So conversely, tillage is a management strategy. Now, that's not something some dedicated no-till people or want to really go there, but it is true that tillage can help manage a slug population. Here are a couple of photos of two sections of the same field with photos taken on the same day. I use that cap there as a reference for the vigor of the plants. This is slug damage in a field with heavy residue. Other side of the field, same day, same field. This is with the residue removed, and you can see how much better shape the plants are in from no slug feeding. Another management tip we have is to plant as early as you're able. The reason for that, and I'll go back to this slide here where we have these slugs that are getting bigger and bigger and hungrier and hungrier. The idea is if you can plant early and adopt whatever practice you can to accelerate plant growth, the slugs don't really start getting active when it's still quite chilly. They need a little bit of warmth to be able to get out, move around, and do their slug thing. So if you can give those plants a jump start, you may kind of grow the plants beyond the point where they're super vulnerable when those slug populations do start moving around and start getting hungry. Circling back again to these baits, there are a couple of different formulations, a couple of different types. I always want to bring this up because it's important to realize insecticides, the things we use to spray for insect problems in our field, are not effective against slugs. Slugs are not insects. Insecticides do not kill them. The other chemical options are formulated as pellets that the slug has to eat. This is not a contact poison. They're formulated to be tasty to slugs, and the slugs have to eat them for them to be effective. The most effective compound is metaldehyde. That would be the active ingredient in probably the most commonly used slug, and probably the most effective slug baited pellet is Deadline MP. There are also iron phosphate formulations, and Sluggo and Ferox are two examples. Iron phosphate is organic and organic certified material, whereas metaldehyde is not. These can be expensive. Estimates I've heard from people who sell it $20 or more an acre. And you really want to be careful how you apply this. The bait will dissolve in water, and then it won't be available for the slug to come along and chomp on it. So you really want to put these down if you're going to invest in them. You want to put them down when you're not expecting rain for a few days. If you're expecting rain tomorrow, that's not a good time to put it down because the pellets will dissolve and you won't get the benefit from them. This metaldehyde, it comes from I think there's really only one manufacturer of it, a company in Switzerland, and they recommend a 5% active ingredient, but most of the formulations that actually get sold in the US range from 3.5% to 4%. And some garden products, things you would buy for slug management in your garden, are even less. And some of the older products, even for field crops, were as low as 2%. And when you get too low, these subtoxic doses, the slugs can recover. So you really want to look for the highest percentage of active ingredient that you can find. Metaldehyde in Ohio is approved for broadcast application in both corn and soybean. That is not the case, for example, in Michigan. And the rates are different for the two crops. And I don't know why people have said why different rates. I don't know, but the labeled rate in corn is 25 pounds per acre, and in soybean it is 10 pounds per acre. And here's just a little peek at that label to back me up on this. When you're dealing with these pellets, it's a little bit tricky to spread them. It can be done, but you have to be a little bit careful how you do it. There are spreader devices that you can use to help get better coverage. And so you don't want to clump everything in one place. You want to get a good broadcast through the field. So does it work? It can work. Here are two pictures in the same field, same time, plots with the bait showing, pretty good stand, pretty vigorous plants. And then below are plots without the bait, and it's a lot thinner there. So it can work. If you use this, if you invest it and you use it, you want to verify that it did work. And so that means you want to go back and check a few days after you put it down. Again, check at dusk so that you can look for the slugs themselves, but also look at the plant damage. And don't just look at whether you have holes in the leaves, because holes in the leaves on older leaves could be the damage that happened from before. What you really want to look at is the newer growth, and you want to look, is the damage still happening? And if you've done a good job knocking that slug population back, hopefully those new leaves will not be particularly chewed upon. So that was all about metaldehyde. Iron phosphate is the other baited pellet option. As I said, it's approved for organic farms. It's typically the second choice after metaldehyde. It's not as effective. It has to go on at a pretty high rate. A couple of products are Sluggo and Ferox, Ferox is a newer formulation that has a chelated iron. And word on the street is this may be more effective of the iron phosphate baits, but we do need more independent research to really look at that. Now, there are other approaches. There's a lot of folklore kind of around slug management, but here's one that actually has been tested. The nitrogen solutions. And people really love this idea because it's like pouring slug on the salt and spraying a nitrogen solution on the field to kill the slugs. Now, it can work, but I'm going to give you some caveats here. It is not an easy fix. And I'm going to show you the one really well-controlled trial that I could find showing that it can work, but it's a commitment. And you got to follow the rule of 3. 30% nitrogen, which is a 1-to-1 ratio in water. 3 a.m., that's when the slugs are out and about, 3 nights in a row. So it's a real commitment. It has to be at night because you have to spray it on the slug's body. It's not going to do any good if you just get it on the ground and the plants and the slugs come out the next day. That's not enough. And you want to be careful because this rate is a fairly high nitrogen spray and it can cause toxicity in soybeans. Corn is a little less susceptible to it. And here is the data from the one good study that I could find showing that it can be effective. So this is untreated plots. These are plots that had 5 gallons per acre, 10 gallons per acre, and 20 gallons. And this was a rate of 10 gallons of urea per 10 gallons of water. And this is the number of slugs. So you do have a significant reduction in slug population at that 10-gallon rate. You have even more reduction at the 20-gallon rate, but you're really flirting with some toxicity at this point. Lanate spray is an insecticide that actually is labeled for use on slugs in corn and soybean in some states. This is also a nighttime application, direct contact on the slug's body. Now, I've only been able to find one study on this conducted in Delaware. And in this study, at 5 days after treatment, they had no significant difference in damage or slug counts between the treated plots and the checks. So I do not recommend this lanate as, even though it's labeled, I do not recommend it for slug management. I said I'd talk about some of the interesting new research that's coming out of public universities on slugs. And this is a nice work that's done by Dr. John Tooker and the folks in his lab, John is my counterpart at Penn State University. And he was looking at the relationship between ground beetles, slugs, and insecticidal seed treatments. And it's kind of an interesting story. Let's take a look at the slug food chain. So at the bottom of this food chain, you have plants, you have crop plants, you have weeds that they can also eat. So you have these plants, and then the slugs are eating the plants. And then these ground beetles are predatory insects that are very common in agricultural fields. And ground beetles are big predators of slugs, probably the #1 natural enemy of slugs in field crops. And these ground beetles, they kind of got a nickname, the lions of no-till fields. They're especially common in no-till, which is good because that's where you find the slugs. So slugs are victim to ground beetles, and ground beetles can be good biological control agents for slugs, but the use of pesticides interfere with them. And it's not just a spray, an insecticide spray that can knock back your ground beetle population. Let's talk about insecticidal seed treatments. So this would be a product like Cruiser, for example. They are very commonly used in corn and soybean. And these are systemic insecticides. They're applied to the seed coat. That's the color you see. And then when the plant germinates, that insecticide is taken up into the plant tissue and spreads through the plant tissue, and the plant tissue itself contains the insecticide. So along comes a slug, and it eats one of these seedling plants that has all of this insecticide in it. Well, that doesn't kill the slug because it's an insecticide. Slugs aren't insects. Insects don't affect it. So it eats in all this insecticide-packed plant, and then it excretes this insecticide in its slime. It's a compound it doesn't need. It just moves it on out. And a very interesting pattern emerges. John Tooker and his lab noticed that in fields that had these neonicotinoid seed treatments, slug problems were actually worse. This is over time, and this is the slug monitoring. Red is the slug population in plots or fields that had insecticidal seed treatment. Blue is naked seed, and almost always consistently throughout the monitoring period, the insecticide-treated seeds, those plots had more slugs. So I told you that the toxin comes out in the slug slime. So then what happens to the beetle when it eats this slug that has all this insecticide all gooped on it? Here is a movie, and hopefully we will be able to get this movie to work. This is a normal ground beetle, very frisky, lots of energy. Now it eats one of these toxic slugs, and now look at it. That toxic slug with all of that insecticide that it was excreting was a very bad meal for this ground beetle. And so taken at a more of a population level, you can see how this would really impact your ground beetle population. So under slug management tips, I would add this as an alternate approach. Avoid using these neonicotinoid insecticide seed treatments if you do not need them for specific pests. Now, I'm not talking about fungicide seed treatments. I'm talking specifically about the insecticide component. And there are actually rather few instances where you do actually truly need that insecticidal seed treatment. In my opinion, this is one of the most wasted crop inputs, most used, costs the most, that doesn't provide the return. There are a few situations where it is good to have an insecticidal seed treatment in corn or soybean. They are effective for early season bean leaf beetles in soybean. Now, this is a very rare problem. And even with rather a lot of leaf feeding, these soybeans compensate. And as the beetles progress through their life cycle, the plants just come back. So unless you're having actual stand loss from bean leaf beetle feeding, you don't really have a problem. Now, there can be soil pests, such as wireworms, especially on ground that's coming out of CRP. In those instances, it can be useful to have an insecticidal seed treatment. Also, if you are running a dairy operation and a lot of manure goes onto the field, those type of fields can have problems with seed corn maggot. Insecticidal seed treatments are useful against seed corn maggot, but apart from these very specific cases, you probably don't need an insecticidal seed treatment. There's a lot of interest in whether having different types of cover crops can help with slug management. Slugs do have very broad food ranges. They're not picky eaters, but they probably do have some feeding preferences, and some plants they like less than others. They really seem to like rye and soybean, and the word on the street is that they dislike crimson clover. Now, I've not been able to line up a study to actually document this. I think this would be a very interesting topic for more research. There's also a lot of growing interest in planting green. This is a study again from John Tooker's lab, and he was working with the Criswell family in Union County, Pennsylvania. And these are the Criswells, and the Criswells were very innovative farmers, and they had a really good observation to make. And that is, when you have a field that has only the crop plant in it, there's only one food there for the slugs to eat, the crop plant. And you also don't have much habitat to help the natural enemies out. So they wanted to investigate planting green with rye. And so they were working with Dr. Tooker on looking at rye intercropped with corn, because now the slugs, which really do like rye, have something else to eat. And this is work that's still ongoing, but just a sneak preview of this. In this graph here, you have the slug populations in plots that did not have the rye intercrop, more slugs and less slugs where you, or less slugs damage, I think this is, where you have the rye. And also where you have the rye, you have more ground beetles. Now there are all kinds of agronomic complications to planting green. It's not like a simple, straightforward, just do it thing. I think it's a tricky balance, and I am not an agronomist, so I'm not saying this is an easy fix, but it might be something, if you do have a lot of slug problems, you might be interested in playing with this, and definitely do some agronomic consultation so that you don't kind of mess yourself up with your cash crop. So adding to other approaches here, cover crops and intercropping and planting green, maybe future slug solutions, but we really do need more research before we have a definitive recommendations on those. So that is the end of my slides, and I've saved a little bit of time